Welcome, seekers of hidden knowledge, to the mystical realm of the occult. Delve into the secrets of the universe as we journey together into the enigmatic world of ancient wisdom. Brought to you by your guide through the shadows of enlightenment, Wisdom Rocker. Uncover the mysteries, unlock the power, and journey with us as we explore the hidden depths within the pages of forgotten scrolls and ancient texts. Prepare to embark on a journey beyond the ordinary, where wisdom transcends time and knowledge is your greatest ally. Welcome to Wisdom Rocker. Prepare to awaken your inner sage. In this video, we will be uncovering the wisdom within the chapters of
Lectures on Ancient Philosophy. Written by Manly P. Hall. Chapter 4. The Inferior Creation and its Regent. In the Platonic system of philosophy, the dot is called the one. The early mystics held that being should be considered the first, in that one is a being. Plato, however, maintained that the one is all being, because being is a condition of the one and consequently dependent upon it. The fallacy of terms is again apparent. Being in this sense has no connection with the thought of to be or exist, but signifies that which is without existence in that it has neither a positive nor a negative state. Thus, while Plato assails the term, he still maintains in his philosophic writings the existence of a universal state preceding the one, but denies that this universal state should be called being, intimating that it should always be assumed by the mind but no effort ever made to denominate it. The moment denomination is given, this abstract quality becomes the one, in that definition cannot possibly be applied to the absolute, the one being the highest definable state. The line out of the dot, or the one, is called the beautiful, the circle, or radius of the line, the good. In this manner is established the great Platonic triad, the one, the beautiful and the good. The Pythagoreans conceived the number one to be before all numbers. It is called the capstone of the pyramid of numbers. All other numbers are simply aggregations of ones. 2 is 2 ones, 3, 3 ones, a million ones. Remove the one and you destroy all numbers. Therefore, it is the first and has absolute priority. The power and dignity of the number one are expressed in permanence, stability, immovability. In philosophy, beauty is a form of motion or emotion. The beautiful is an eternal flow, it is the one in motion. The good, which is the third and lowest aspect, contains or accepts into itself the nature of the beautiful, it is the manifestation of the beautiful in the sphere of creation. For example, he who has the beautiful within his own soul radiates the good and is called the good. It may be said that to be beautiful is good, also, that to be good is beautiful. Consequently, that is good which contains beauty. From this Platonic definition it is apparent why the savior gods of all nations have been symbolized as beautiful. Aesthetically considered, beauty is the redeeming power. When the human soul opens itself to the reception of beauty, it is then transmuted. Beauty is a force into the presence of which none can come and remain unmoved. Beauty is an internal force symbolic of supersubstantial harmony manifesting through goodness. In its final analysis, good is symmetry, or the harmonious coordination of parts. In other words, that is good in which the parts work together. That individual is good in whom the natural forces function naturally. It also follows that a symmetry of parts is harmonious, and harmony of parts produces a concord which is termed beautiful. According to the ancients, the world is the receptacle for the beautiful, which in turn manifests the all-knowing of the one. This lecture is to be devoted to a consideration of the world that is called good and how, through the continual adversary, it ultimately affects the perfection and liberation of the rational nature. The world is a form and forms are molded from matter. Matter ranges from an unrecognizable state of crystallization to an unrecognizable state of vitalization, both extremes alike intangible because of the inability of our sense perceptions to cognize any ultimate. Form exists not only in things that can be seen but in such as can be perceived through the senses of hearing, touch, taste and smell. Form therefore, is not merely a physical body that can be seen, it may be a subtle emanation as light or sound. A word cannot be seen and yet a word is a form. Under certain conditions drug addicts can see words coming out of people's mouths, their supersensitiveness being the result of a low form of drug-invoked psychism. A thought is not visible, nor can it be held between the fingers, and yet a thought is as truly a form as is a piece of stone. The inferior universe therefore, includes every conceivable state or condition of form. Form is the inferior nature of everything manifesting being. Form includes not only every part of the universe from the mental level downward but, ultimately, up through the higher spiritual spheres, in fact, every plane upon which differentiation exists, but the planes of consciousness above that of thought and the entities dwelling therein, have a term other than form applied to them. The circle, or circumference, is therefore, the symbol of feelings, thoughts, and bodies in all their infinite ramifications. The ancients symbolized form and the laws controlling the organization of matter into bodies by a reaping skeleton, the emblem of death. Form has ever been regarded as the parent of ignorance. Throughout the inferior creation consciousness lies buried in form. Form is the confusing, resisting, limiting, inhibiting and imprisoning part of existence. Nothing in whose nature even a trace of form remains is capable of absolute consciousness. Form is the graveyard of consciousness. Since all life is thus, inhibited by form, no creature controlled by the form part is rational. Philosophically speaking, absolute form, that is, the ultimate degree of form is ultimate negation, because it is the absence of all that is necessary to the greatest good. In its most enmeshed state life is at its lowest ebb. Therefore, in philosophy form is termed the eternal adversary. In Egypt form was called Typhon, and as a symbol of his disrepute he was pictured with the head of a crocodile and the body of a hog, sometimes the wings of a bat were added. Form is always the destroyer. In India form is known as Shiva, or Rudra, the Lord of Destruction, or rather, the principle behind the form is so defined. In the realm of philosophy form is one of the unsolved problems of the ages, for it is in reality simply an inferior life inhibiting the manifestation of a superior life. In this sea of confusing form elements men live and move and have their being, and out of the ever-changing substances of form all mortal creatures build their bodies, which are thus, destined to return to the elemental spheres from which they were derived. The universe of matter that extends throughout the infinite vistas of unmeasured space and includes within itself the heavenly bodies functioning through space and bearing with them an indescribable diversity of flora and fauna, is all part of what the ancients termed the underworld. Even the apparent vacuum in which these mighty bodies exist and the host of invisible agencies that order sidereal dynamics, form part of a vast but inferior creation manifesting through the realm of form. This world of form, suns, moons and stars is called Hades, or the land of death. It is the world of darkness. It is called dark because in it the light of spirit is swallowed up and creatures move in the haze of uncertainty. Darkness, however, does not imply evil, but simply the lack of light. In the sphere of form all creatures lack the full brilliance of consciousness or awareness. In this dark world, which is the circumference of the circle of existence, man is at his greatest degree of separateness from spiritual source, and the sphere in which he functions is the lowest degree of divine agency. All through mythology the gods of light and life fight the demons of darkness and death. In the Babylonian mythology Merodach slays the dragon, and in the Christianized version of the myth Saint George is the hero. The dragon of matter, a foul, flame-breathing monster, must be slain by Siegfried in order that the treasure of the Nibelung may be recovered. Every creature struggles against the inertia of its immediate personal environment. Inertia is the characteristic attribute of form. It must be realized that this is inertia in a relative sense, for if matter be reduced to its ultimate, it will be found to consist of life particles vibrating at incredible rates of speed. In comparison to the consciousness of man, however, matter is unconscious. In comparison to the active principles of the universe, matter is negative. On the other hand, in comparison to orders of life undoubtedly existing, but unknown to us, matter may very well be considered positive. Matter, or form, simply represents the unconquered environment that surrounds every life struggling for existence. As the world of life and consciousness represents the spiritual nature of deity, so the vast ocean of matter, continually changing and manifesting an infinitude of forms, is the inferior part or body of deity. As all creatures are made in the image of their universal creator, it follows that each has a spiritual nature which is part of and harmonious with the spiritual nature of the universe, and also a material nature which is part of and harmonious with the cosmic body. When the emphasis of the life is upon its spiritual part, we term the individual idealistic, but when the emphasis is upon the material part, we term him materialistic. Character is determined by the plane of his own nature upon which the emphasis of the individual's life is placed. Every human being has moments when he rises above his own level, also, moments when he sinks below that level. This level may be termed in music the keynote of the individual, with the sharp as its higher and the flat as its lower phase. In Chaldean philosophy there is the wonderful legend of Ishtar and Tammuz. The story deals particularly with the descent of Ishtar through the 7 worlds into Hades, the inferior sphere. The allegory simply signifies the incarnation of the rational soul in the substances of the irrational world. The irrational world is divided into 7 strata by the rings of the planets upon which sit, according to the mysteries, the 7 governors of the world, each of whom bestows upon the incarnating soul one of the 7 limitations of matter called veils by Hermes. However, in the myth of Ishtar, instead of the soul being veiled or having certain adornments given to it, the allegory sets forth the limitation of spiritual power through the removal of certain divine attributes. These attributes signify the functioning of certain spiritual forces, which functioning is rendered impossible by the involvements of the soul in matter. The spiritual properties of the rational self are symbolized by a crown, jewels, breast and body adornments and sandals. As Ishtar descends through the 7 gates of the 7 governors, each takes from her one of her spiritual qualities until, deprived of all the evidence of her royal birth, spiritual origin, she arrives in the house of no return, the dark and gloomy precincts of death. Each human soul entering into mortal incarnation has thus been robbed, by the 7 worlds of matter, of the manifesting proofs of its divinity until, helpless and impotent, the all-knowing spiritual man appears in the physical world as a wide-eyed babe incapable even of self-preservation. Thus, the immortal assumes the dream of mortality, and clouded by the veils of the 7 planets takes up the humdrum of mortal existence, all oblivious to the godhood within. Robbed of her adornments, Ishtar must patiently accept the infirmities heaped upon her by the irate goddess of death. After many tribulations, Ishtar is at last rescued from her infernal prison through the intercession of the deities, and ascending once more through the heavenly gates receives back the symbols of her royal rank and dignity. Then, spreading her wings, she soars upward to the spheres of light. Philosophically considered, the descent of the rational nature of man into its irrational body is involution, the resurrection of the rational nature from this condition of immersion, evolution. The physical universe is the sphere of ignorance where each creature is at its worst in that it has forgotten the best within itself. So thick and numerous are the veils of the rings that the light of spirit is obscured until but a dim haze bears witness of its effulgence. It naturally follows that accomplishment in the physical world is the greatest of all accomplishments, for it is under the most difficult of all situations. Here is a key to the story of the prodigal son, who represents the incarnating soul. The pigsty where he must eat and sleep with the hogs represents one ancient patriarch's concept of the physical universe. When at last the prodigal, having repented of his iniquities and having seen the folly of material existence, returned to the house of his father, the light world, the fatted calf was killed in his honor, for his accomplishment was great. Jealous of the attention bestowed upon the improvident youth, the elder brother made his dissatisfaction known to his father, who replied that there was ample cause for rejoicing in that the lost had been found and the dead lived again. The story carries the same thought permeating Egyptian philosophy, namely, that life in the mortal sphere without a realization of the divine plan is the true death, that resurrection from this state is the most desired of all attainments. Yet to rise victorious from the dark world of hopeless involvement is an accomplishment so noble that it elevates the conquering soul to a dignity exceeding that of the angels who are never confronted with this problem. The stupefying effect of matter, rather its organizations into form, is appropriately symbolized by cold. Those of you who have been out when it was 60 degrees below zero know what it means when the mercury freezes, and the air is filled with a continuous crackling sound. Huge logs split from end to end with a sound like the report of a great gun, and even the nails seem to ooze out of the wood. It is hard to fight cold because it discourages the effort to resist its influence. Over the nature gradually comes a feeling of comfort and peace accompanied by an overwhelming desire to rest. No prospect seems so pleasant as to go to sleep in the snow. No effort seems so unnecessary as to fight against the innate urge to drift off into the sleep of death. Cold fights you by taking away your desire to resist. This is the most insidious of all foes and is comparable to the way in which form destroys spiritual initiative. Materiality does not attack the body or the conscious functioning of the mind, it assails the willpower and destroys the morale. As long as there is the desire to fight ignorance and degeneracy, as long as there is the inner urge to resist evil and the illusions of matter, it is possible to attain liberation with reasonable effort. Form, however, fights in an underhanded way by taking away the desire to master its elements and substituting therefore the lethargy of indifference which prefers to leave things just as they are and go along with the rest of the world, enjoying its momentary pleasures and suffering as resolutely as possible the concurrent ills of life. When the material urge of physical environment has so benumbed the inner nature that every spiritual aspiration is anesthetized, the individual is reduced to the level of that mediocre throng who are content to struggle along in the age-old ruts. Such have hypnotized themselves into the false belief that existing conditions are inevitable and unchangeable. When the desire to do right for the sake of right is smothered by matter, there is left but one power capable of dealing with the problem of inertia, namely, pain, either mental, physical or emotional. Through suffering, the insufficiency of material accomplishments is demonstrated. The desire to do good for the sake of good is an urge far too subtle to survive the stifling influence of matter. Hence to counteract man's incessant effort to forget his own spiritual needs is his continual proclivity to hurt himself. Man's effort to control his own life without intelligence invariably demonstrates its futility. He strives to live without the help of consciousness, with the result that he exists in pain and tribulation. Because of his suffering he acquires a great incentive toward knowledge for its own sake in order to save himself from the pain resulting from ignorance. Thus, the law of self-preservation is ever forcing the way. Ward feet back into the path that leads to light. Physical suffering first led man to ponder the mysteries of his own being. In the last analysis, however, The pain of the body is the least poignant. Then came emotional suffering, the pain in the heart much more desperate and difficult to endure. Lastly came mental suffering, in which the entire constitution is torn and racked by that gargantuan conflict when the faculties of the mind hurl thought missiles at each other. Looking at the average individual, we see a consciousness that is impotent in the grasp of form which, like cold, has benumbed its sensibilities. Cold is the proper symbol of the circumference of the sphere of being. The word hell, derived from the Scandinavian hell, means cold, though it has long been associated with its opposite term, heat. This discloses a certain consistent inconsistency characteristic of the works of man. Some missionaries visiting the far north described in glowing terms the sulphurous nature of hell. As a result, the Eskimos were immediately interested, for the underworld was thereby made particularly inviting to a race that found extreme difficulty in keeping heat in their chilled organisms. Obviously, any intimate description of hell depends for its effectiveness upon the equation of longitude and latitude. Just as life, light and heat are associated with the quality of expansion, since the natural impulse of life is to expand, so death, darkness and cold are related to the quality of contraction, since the natural impulse of death is to contract. Realizing, according to the ancient mysteries, that the physical universe was the sphere of death and that there was no death so real as immersion in form, let us now consider the nature and structure of this great dark sphere as it was taught to the philosophers of ancient days and is still preserved among those groups who are perpetuating the ancient wisdom. The material universe considered as a unit is the body of the Lord of form or the master of the world. This world Lord, whose consciousness is of the nature of mind, is the Jehovah or Ihvh of the Jews, the Zeus of the Greeks and the Jupiter of the Romans. In the philosophy of the Gnostics and the Neo-Platonists he was called the Demiurgus. The original interpretation of this word is difficult to ascertain, but it may be rendered in its philosophic sense as the false urge. The Demiurgus is therefore, to be defined as the composite material universe considered as a personal being or power. The emanations from this Lord are called his powers and are sometimes referred to as the princes of the world. You will remember that Jesus warned his disciples that the princes of this world would never understand him and that they had nothing in common with him. The princes of the world are the divisions of the forces controlling the form universe, these forces being considered as gods. Philosophically, the Lord of the world is the great autocrat, for autonomy is a principle non-existent in the universal sense. This despot, who is conceived as using the earth for his footstool and the heavens for his throne, is presumed to control his universe through the inexorable justice of law, which because of man's ignorance breeds fear, hate and death. When you think of the philosophic Trinity, remember that the third person of this triad is the Lord of the world, called the Heartless One because he is the slave-driver of the cycle of necessity. He is the terrible ogre or giant of hate, so-called, who grinds our bones to make his bread. The ancients were divided in their opinions concerning the real nature of the Demiurgus. Some affirmed him to be a devil because he is an agency that is ever destroying. But does he not wreak destruction in order that reconstruction may follow upon a higher level of manifestation? He is the Lord of death because he controls birth and death, for these phenomena exist nowhere except in the world of forms. Again, some have attributed to him the diabolical genius of a madman who created a nightmare universe where everything is as it should not be. He is the power that binds man to the world of illusion and in the terms of the early church fathers is the enemy of the eternal God, good. Paraphrasing, however, the statements of Omar, the question may be asked, if he be evil, who placed him there? In Faust, Mephistopheles, the agent of the Demiurgus, is made to say, I am the spirit of negation, part of the power that still works for good while ever scheming ill. Accordingly, the second group of ancient philosophers declared the demiurgus to be ever adding to the glory of God by demonstrating the insufficiency of the form world. He is therefore, not the enemy of good but the eternal contrast to good necessary that man may realize the perfection of right. Who would know or appreciate good if he had not experienced the lack of it? The Lord of the world is therefore, the master who whips man until, unable longer to bear the lashes of unkind destiny, the sufferer revolts against his own insufficiency and thus, is directed into the way of light. In antiquity the Lord of the world was well symbolized as the master of the whip and the wielder of the flail. The Egyptian pharaohs carried 3 scepters symbolic of their authority from the demiurgus, the Anubis-headed staff, symbolic of the sagacity of the world lord, the shepherd's crook, symbolic of the priesthood and the authority of the world lord over the souls of men, and the flail, symbolic of the mastery which the demiurgus exercises over the bodies of all creatures. Returning to our primitive symbolism, the Anubis-headed staff is symbolized by the dot, the shepherd's crook by the line and the flail by the circle. These are representative respectively of rulership through wisdom, rulership through faith and rulership through force. Thus, the dot is now termed government. It was once the crown, but now so large a part of government is administered by the people that the crown can only be used in its abstract sense. The dot, however, signifies government by the state. The line is the tiara, or government by the church, and the circumference is the people who are the beneficiaries of government. Thus, we find 3 tremendous forces continually focused upon the objective life of man, and the perversion of these forces constitutes the threefold fountainhead of evil as opposed to the threefold fountainhead of light. Through the perversion of government, we have ignorance. Through the perversion of the church, superstition, and through the perversion of the people, fear. Thus, come into existence the great Masonic trio of evils, ignorance, superstition and fear, the murderers of human liberty and the destroyers of understanding. Although we conceive ourselves to exist in a world amply lighted physically by the sun and adequately illumined mentally and ethically by philosophy, religion and science, we actually dwell in a sphere as dark as Egypt's night. There is but one true light in the universe, namely, the light of understanding, a trait in which humanity is woefully deficient. The presence of hope, belief and fear is definite proof that the world lacks knowledge and adequate spiritual perceptions. The darkness of this underworld is so dense that we cannot perceive the hearts of our fellow men. We cannot sense the motives that inspire our neighbor to action, nor can we pierce the surrounding gloom and see that which lies but a few steps ahead. While humanity sojourns in this underworld of mortal light and spiritual darkness, it is actually passing through an embryonic state. Within the womb of matter, fetal man is being prepared for birth into the greater universe of divine realities. The physical universe may therefore be termed the antechamber of cosmos, the little room with the hole in the floor referred to in the mysteries. As infant man must be carried for the 9 months of the prenatal epoch before his organisms are able to bear exposure to external conditions, so the world must carry within the darkness of its own nature for 9 philosophic months that mortal who is to be born into life and unfoldment through the substance of higher spheres. In ancient philosophy, this physical universe is referred to as a great egg wherein all manners of creatures are passing through prenatal epochs. People have the mistaken idea that when they come into physical existence they are born. In their egotism they have forgotten that all mortal things are embryo gods who cannot achieve to divinity until they have transcended every vestige of mortality. Every living thing is an embryo. In some previous embryonic state, we lost our gills and caudal appendage. The webs of our fingers and toes were also cut and our tongues loosened. But even with these evidence of progress we come into this world imperfect and incomplete, or, as the theologian would say, we are conceived in sin and born in iniquity. This statement has no reference to indiscretions of our ancestors but to the philosophic fact that the mortal universe, when compared to the transcendency of the higher worlds, is a sphere of sin and death. By physical birth we have merely exchanged the amniotic fluids of the womb for the somewhat less dense atmospheric fluids of the world. We are still bound to the earth by an umbilical cord of sense, interest and desire, and not until through the development of our discerning faculties we acquire the power to sever this bondage to the inferior nature can it be said that we are really born. This great egg surrounding the material sphere has for its inner surface that canopy of the heavens which man vainly seeks to explore with high-powered telescopes. With each improvement in equipment, he is enabled to penetrate a little farther into the blue haze of space. He always reaches a point, however, where vision fails, and impenetrable space goes on. The moment man arrives at the limit of his own faculties, he reaches the walls of a hypothetical sphere that hem him in and isolate him from the rest of being. The Hermetist likened the physical universe to a glass globe in which were contained numberless vapors and seething forces. As the agonies of chemical change may be viewed through the walls of the test tube, so, like the Bunsen burner, that mysterious power called cosmic urge unceasingly agitates the chemicals contained within the globe of physical existence. While enclosed within this impenetrable shell, man cannot conceive of a universe beyond, of a state nobler or more enduring than his present state. Life is thus composed of a host of creatures, seemingly like atoms in space, whirling round and round forever within this crystalline shell of the universal egg. At last, however, comes the great day. Be with us when the egg of the universe is broken and the substances therein imprisoned flow back once more into their first and primitive absoluteness. Thus, floating upon the face of absolute being is a finite globe destined to remain for a little while. This globe is the vast material universe of countless worlds and suns which overwhelms us with its immensity but which, when compared with the absolute limitlessness of space, is of pygmy proportions. Though but an atom within the tortured body of this globe, humanity cherishes its dream of existence, striving with the feeble fingers of its mind to grasp the threads of universal wisdom by which the globe is held suspended from its unknown source. Although this globe filled with the contents of material existence is being hurled through space to ultimate destruction, the secret philosophy of the ancients taught that it was possible for the individual to free himself from the swirling mass and by right of his own divinity break through the shell of the world egg and thereby achieve individual liberation. Upon this hypothesis nearly all the mysteries of antiquity were established, a notable exception being the Jewish, which taught that there was no liberation for one apart from all. Alchemy offers an excellent symbolic description of the processes of spiritual liberation. At this point it is apropos to consider the philosophical definition of the word spirit. This has nothing in common with its accepted theological meaning. In philosophy, spirit is not the divine part of every nature considered as an individuality, but rather this divine part considered as one undivided causal nature permeating all life. In the Buddhist philosophy, spirit and soul are considered part of the illusion of matter in the sense that an individual who speaks of his spirit or his soul speaks without realization of the fact that there is but one spirit in the universe and all so-called divisions of it are purely hypothetical. Hence, though there may be an infinity of bodies existing in the sphere of Maya, there is but one consciousness, which the Oriental mystic pleases to term the self. Of not-selves there are myriads, of self, but one. To think of spirit as divided into a host of individual units, each embodied in a separate form, is to think in terms of error. To the mystic the idea of the growth of his own spirit apart from the growth of the spirit of all is inconceivable. That which grows to the point where it bursts through the egg of existence is consequently not the spirit but what the Greeks termed the rational soul, or the mental power, which represents the highest form of individuality. It therefore, follows that it is as impossible for one individual to have a spirit more highly evolved than another as for one area of the sea to be wetter than another. The degree of development is thus measured first by the extent to which the parts of the lower nature have been synchronized, and secondly by the interval of quality between them and their spiritual cause. No one has a consciousness higher than another, for there is but one consciousness in the universe. He who is presumed to have a higher consciousness is simply one whose organisms are fine enough to manifest more completely the potentialities of this single consciousness. Mankind may be considered as a vast organism with one spirit or self manifesting through an infinite number of intellectual and physical organisms, the latter deluded into the belief that they are free and independent. On a still higher level, this composite spirit of all mankind, which is merely an expression of the universal spirit of all things, is deluded, in turn, by the concept that mankind is different and separate from the rest of universal being. Such terms as old and young, highly evolved and less evolved, spiritual and material, should be applied only to personalities and individualities, for in the sphere of consciousness they do not exist. As the Absolute is ageless, being all age, no part can technically be older than another. Hence difference is an illusion of the mind, but necessary however to the present evolution of life, yet without foundation in divine reality. To return to alchemy, self or spirit is the universal gold, the king of the metals. Gold exists in every element of the universe, even the sunlight and the atmosphere contain minute quantities of this precious metal. The base substances surrounding this universal or spiritual gold are referred to as the lesser metals. The purpose of alchemical experimentation was to germinate that seed of universal gold, which when properly nurtured would take unto itself and tincture the base metals, absorbing them all into its own glory. Ultimately self, the only enduring state, thus, absorbs into its own being all the phases of the not-self. Touching them with its transmuting power, it causes them to become one with its own effulgence. According to the Greek terminology, the gold is the rational soul, and the transmutation process that of distilling the golden elixir from the base substances of ignorance and perversion. When you have gathered your proper elements, says the alchemist, you place them in a retort and hermetically seal it. You then begin the cycles of distillation, causing the chemicals to pass through an orderly sequence of increasing intensity until finally a point is reached where the elixir thus distilled seeps through the glass without injuring it and passes off like a hot oil, there being no container in the world sufficiently strong to hold it. The allegory is evident. The hermetically sealed vessel is the lower world, the way in and out stopped by the mysteries of birth and death. The chemicals are the heterogeneous mass of created things thrown together in a mysterious fashion. The cycles of distillation are the processes of evolution, so-called, by which the life is given ever fuller expression through regenerated vehicles and gradually released from irrationality. When the cycles of intensification have reached a certain stage, those beings who have attained to this point can no longer be held within the globe of the inferior creation, and the soul seeps through the wall of the egg of existence, or, as the Buddhist might say, enters nirvana. This is the rebirth out of the womb of necessity. This is the time when man releases himself from the bonds that bind him to the wheel of birth and death. He who has attained this end is rightly termed no longer a man but the philosopher's stone. According to the concept of mystical philosophy, every individual passes through 2 births and 2 deaths. At the time of the first, or lesser birth, man is born into the irrational sphere where he becomes an objective manifesting creature but loses contact with the subjective spiritual spheres. Technically, therefore, this birth into the outer universe results in the death of the higher self, which must remain asleep in the tomb of material organisms until the great day of liberation. The second birth is, in reality, the death of the lower nature. When it occurs, the rational part reawakens and rising triumphant from its rational sheath, mingles itself with the victorious and illumined eons. At the first birth the self dies out of eternity and enters into the illusion of time. At the second birth, the self ascends out of the illusion of time and diffuses its being throughout the substances of eternity. Everything that is born into material existence passes from a greater to a lesser state. After the elementary birth, which is the immersion of the rational soul into the irrational universe, the soul enters upon what is called the cycle of necessity. The cycle of necessity is simply the wheel of births and deaths. During this cycle the temporarily individualized soul passes from one condition of unreality to another. The intervals between these conditions are the lesser births and deaths which take place within the world egg. There is first the birth into the great egg, then the cycles of birth and death within the egg, referred to as reincarnation or metempsychosis, and finally the philosophic death out of the irrational nature forever. At the time of the philosophic death, which is also the second birth, the soul escapes from matter forever and having pierced through the hypothetical wall of existence returns to the ever-enduring state of the Absolute. By way of digression, let us consider a little more in detail the subject of reincarnation. There is a popular misconception concerning the continuity of identity throughout the cycle of incarnations. People are heard to say, "I wish I knew who I was in my last incarnation," or "I think I must have been a Hindu in my last life." According to the most profound systems of thought, the so-called personalities which come forth out of the silent watcher are all pendant from this single cause but are not directly related to each other. Among the potentialities of the self is the power of projecting a host of individualities into temporary existence. After existing their appointed span, these individualities are reabsorbed into the self from whose essences they were originally differentiated. Thus, the spiritual causal nature of man is capable of objectifying periodically a chain of personalities, each a separate and individual creation endowed with separate and individual faculties. For example, John Doe is a personality, being objectified from an impersonal and transcendental nature, itself neither personal nor individual. When John Doe has finished the span of his physical existence, he is absorbed back into his own spiritual causal nature, which is not John Doe nor does it know John Doe, but which is an all-pervading superphysical life. When John Doe has been returned to this universal state, he simply ceases to exist. He will never reincarnate again, nor will his characteristics and traits be perpetuated. The universe will never again know of John Doe. After a period of inaction, however, the spiritual causal nature which gave John Doe being will create a new personality. This personality will neither remember John Doe nor associate its life in any way with that of John Doe, and yet certain qualities will be manifested in the new personality which could not have come into expression had they not passed through certain definite stages of growth while in the personality of John Doe. Therefore, the incarnating individuality of one incarnation never incarnates again. But out of the spiritual origin in which this incarnating life was individualized, new individualized lives will be formed which will come into manifestation and then in turn vanish. Thus, the self gives birth to an infinite number of personalities, but it is the self, not the personalities, that endures. This self does not actually incarnate or reincarnate, but from itself it individualizes incarnating organisms. Consider for a moment the diagram at the beginning of this chapter. The large circle represents the egg of existence, the cosmic sphere, or aura, of the demiurgus, whose outer circumference is termed the ring pass knot or the extremity of manifestation. The line descending and piercing the wall of the great egg is consciousness emerging from the self and merging into the substances of the egg. The point where the descending line breaks the wall of the circle and enters into the limitation of existence is the first birth, the true philosophic death, for the egg is the sepulchre in which consciousness is buried. Having penetrated the wall of the egg, the line of consciousness begins the spiral path of the wheel of necessity. This spiral path is made up of lives and deaths, which are termed incarnations. At last, having through philosophy learned of the true mystery of existence, the consciousness breaks through the wall in the second death, or philosophic birth, and reascends to the sphere of universal consciousness, which is its true dwelling place. It will thus be seen that while the Buddhist theory differs in minor details from the philosophic atheism of the Greeks, its essential nature is the same. In Buddhism, which, as you know, considers deity only in the form of self, or absolute existence, and has no concept of a personal God, reincarnations occur within the lower spheres of the egg of being, those spheres being considered as the ground wherein is set up the wheel of necessity. Accordingly, one great Buddhist philosopher is declared to have said, "Of births and deaths there are a countless number, but one great death and one great birth is the measure of accomplishment." Thus, are differentiated the greater and the lesser cycles. By divine prerogative. By the impulses controlled by law, which is the habit of space, life is periodically immersed in creation, where it continues its spiral progress in the smaller cycle until finally it escapes through the wall of being and finds perfection in its own source. Thus, we have physical existence contrasted with divine existence. The physical birth and death of man is a minor mystery. As sleep is a little death, so birth and death are miniature cycles of existence, but the great death and the great birth are the supreme cycle of existence and the grand mystery of life. Although its physical nature is alone susceptible of analysis, there is within each so-called material creature a spiritual, or superphysical, part. Whether we term it spirit, soul, higher mind, or consciousness, it is that something within the shell of matter which is superior to and must eventually become master of the irrational universe. The only reason that this higher part is confined within the lower world is that man as an individual neither appreciates this inner strength nor understands how to directionalize it in order that it may achieve liberation and carry with it to perfection the lesser parts which are under its domination. The rational soul, or spiritual life of man, has a higher origin and is predestined to attain a far more noble end than is appreciable to the mortal mind with its limited comprehension. Now comes a legitimate question: just how can man escape from the crystal ball of matter with its limiting materializing agencies and return to the dawn land from which he originally came? Liberation is to be attained most simply, according to the Eastern school, through the projection of consciousness. We have already intimated that man lives upon the level of his thoughts. The universe that is real to him is simply that world with which his thinking has attuned him. When man causes his consciousness to accept the reality of the illusionary universe, he is swallowed up in the illusions he has thus affirmed. The moment consciousness rises above the level of illusion, man is freed from its limiting influences. Man is composed of three major parts: a divine part which may be correlated to the dot of primitive symbolism, a superhuman part correlated to the line, and a human or natural part correlated to the circle. When he lives upon the level of the physical plane and is controlled by his physical propensities, man is necessarily en rapport with the physical universe and subject to the inconsistencies and incongruities of matter. When he lifts his consciousness above material things and lives in the world of his higher mind, man then dwells in the intellectual sphere. This is a much broader vista, but still is limited to certain fallacies of thinking, for even the higher mind with its magnificent grasp of the problems of lower existence is necessarily imperfect and to a great degree immersed in the maya of physical existence. When ultimately, he lifts his consciousness above mind and thought to spiritual realization, man then lifts his entire nature from the intellectual to the spiritual world. The consummation of this elevation is the goal of human effort, and here and there among the elect of the earth one, like the great Buddha, achieves to perfect realization and absolute liberation. The path of liberation, however, is too difficult for the majority to travel, for few will give up the lesser self with its likes and dislikes in exchange for an abstract reality which has neither desire nor feeling but which dwells in unbroken contemplation throughout eternity. The world in which we live is simply the sphere wherein we have centered our activities. The higher our ideals, the higher are our activities, and consequently the higher is our world. Selfishness is the key to the inferno, for the inferno, or inferior universe, is ruled by selfishness. The physical world is that sphere controlled and directionalized by selfish urges, and every soul that is selfish is bound to the physical universe. Qualities within us bind us to forces outside which are like those qualities. As long as selfishness endures within our own souls, it holds us to the sphere of selfishness without. As we transmute qualities within our own natures, we ascend into new worlds of corresponding consciousness outside. Man is held by his materiality to the material sphere, by his intellectuality to the intellectual sphere, by his ideality to the ideal sphere. But regardless of his own viewpoints or activities, man is eternally bound by his innate reality to the absolute, which is the fullness of reality. When he has extricated himself from the instincts and impulses of materiality, man is philosophically free from the material world. When the intellect within him is transmuted into idealism, man passes from the world of thought to that supramental sphere for which there is no adequate name. The philosophic ascension of the soul is simply the process of raising motives and activities to ever higher levels of idealism. Having lifted his mind to the contemplation of cosmic realities, the philosopher is no longer moved by the considerations of immature materialistic intellects. Having mastered material ambition, the philosopher is incapable of stooping to the petty accomplishments of physically minded people. Having lifted himself out of the physical life, he no longer lives to gratify the whims of his physical nature. The true philosopher is free from material bondage because he ceases to desire material power or material possession. Incapable of desire, he is incapable of the sense of loss. Having outgrown unimportant things, he is not disappointed if he does not possess them. He has learned with the Buddha that possession is a curse, desire a snare, and selfishness an illusion. Of such a sage it may be said that he has climbed up from the valleys of worldliness to the high mountains of clear thinking, where the panorama of the greater life spreads out before him. Dwelling in his world of thought, the philosopher gradually achieves to the realization that the mind which lifted him out of matter has also been outgrown. The mind which made him a man will prevent him from becoming a god. The stone upon which he raised himself thus far has now become a millstone about his neck. Thus, as the philosopher first casts off worldliness to dwell in the broader vista of the mind, so ultimately, he casts off mindfulness that he may enter into the newer and greater vision, the rulership of intellect by spirit. He casts aside the thinker as he would a worn-out body and rises from the mountain tops into the free air of space to vanish gradually as an inconceivable speck in the vast expanse of all. As the sage sits upon his mountain about to cast aside mind and rise into the nirvanic reaches of eternity, the world passes in panoramic review before his enlightened vision. He sees the great inferno spread out below him, about him on the mountain tops the gods of the world, the keepers of the veil of tears. The illumined sage beholds the ways and byways of the earth, a great crisscrossed labyrinth of complexities wherein immortal creatures mistakenly struggles not to prove their own immortality but rather to establish the evidence of mortality. He sees life as a vast chamber with two doors, with birth as the entrance to and death the exit from this mortal span. He then understands the allegorical rituals through which he passed as a neophyte in that day when he himself was raised to light. He realizes that the world of mortal man is a gloomy subterranean sphere peopled with distorted imps who, like the Nibelungen, hoard up treasures in ancient crypts in obedience to the dictates of their crafty king. The philosopher then grasps the import of the mystical allegory of the rope that is lowered into the pit that those who can cling to it may be drawn up to life. The rope is the secret doctrine, and those who catch hold of the swinging cable may be drawn up into the light of reality and truth. In the life of every struggling creature there comes a time when the insufficiency of life within the narrow confines of matter is apparent. By the disciplines of illumination, the soul learns how to cast aside the inadequate coil of mortal limitation and ascend into the sphere of reason, there to dwell in the luminosity of divine proximity. The words of Milton concerning the fall of Satan then become profoundly significant. Him the almighty power hurled headlong flaming from the ethereal sky, with hideous ruin and combustion, down to bottomless perdition, there to dwell in adamantine chains and penal fire. Who durst defy the omnipotent to arms? Satan, who signifies worldliness and self-sufficiency, is rewarded for his effort to establish a kingdom in opposition to the kingdom of good by being forced to dwell in the state of separateness which he himself conceived. In the East the illusion of separateness is looked upon as the cause of all suffering and sorrow. The great work of primitive Buddhism was to emphasize the fundamental unity of life through the doctrine of the one universal self. In the Western world, where competition is held to be the only sound basis of commercial progress, there is a continual wrong emphasis, for the parts are then arrayed against each other and no effort made to emphasize the common ground of being in which all exists as parts of a tremendous whole. The next chapter will be devoted to a consideration of the Eastern philosophy of perfection as accomplished by conscious reunion with absolute being through the Dharma of realization. The mortal sphere of competitive endeavor is hell indeed, wherein creatures exist in servitude to their own desires, while over them the Regent of the world, grim and unrelenting, sits with folded wings upon his throne raised on the dais of the seven heavens.
Thanks for watching the Wisdom Rocker. Don't forget to like, comment, and share.